The rain hammered against the concrete walls of the underground parking garage beneath the Rising Edge Tower in Boston, creating an echo that masked the footsteps of three men closing in on their target. Evelyn Mitchell pressed her key fob repeatedly, but her Mercedes remained dark and silent 20 feet away. The men formed a semicircle, cutting off her escape routes with practiced precision that spoke of professional training and careful planning. Their faces wore the calm expression of men who had done this before, who viewed violence as nothing more than a business transaction to be completed efficiently. In 10 seconds, everything changed. A man in a worn jacket appeared from behind a pillar, his 6-year-old daughter's hand clasped gently in his. Without warning, without hesitation, he moved like liquid shadow flowing between raindrops. The first attacker dropped to his knees, gasping for air that would not come. The second crashed into a concrete column with the sickening crack of bone meeting immovable object. The third tried to run but found himself face down on the wet pavement before he could take 2 steps, his consciousness fading into the darkness of the garage. The man picked up his daughter, who had watched everything with curious eyes that held no fear, only trust in her father's ability to keep the world at bay, and walked away as sirens began to wail in the distance, their red and blue lights painting abstract patterns on the rain-slicked walls. Arthur Graves had lived 36 years, but only the last 7 truly mattered. Every morning at 6:45, he walked his daughter Matilda to school through the narrow streets of Jamaica Plain, their footsteps creating a rhythm that had become the soundtrack of his new life. The sound of their matching rain boots on wet pavement, the whisper of autumn leaves under their feet, the crunch of snow in winter. These were the only cadences that mattered now, replacing the synchronized march of boots on foreign soil that still echoed in his nightmares. The neighbors knew him as the quiet single father who worked part-time at Murphy's Kitchen, a small restaurant where the smell of grease and coffee had long ago seeped into the walls like memories into bones. Mrs. Rodriguez from 2 doors down sometimes watched Matilda after school, always commenting on how the child never complained, never asked for more than was offered, as if she understood that invisibility was a form of protection. He cooked with the same precision he once used for other tasks he never spoke about, tasks that belonged to a man who no longer existed. His knife work was poetry in motion, 47 cuts per minute, each slice exactly 3 millimeters thick, muscle memory that could have been lethal now devoted to creating perfect julienne vegetables. His apartment contained the bare essentials: 2 beds, a kitchen table scarred by years of use, Matilda's drawings covering the refrigerator, and absolutely nothing that could connect him to the years before she entered his life. No photographs from his past, no military memorabilia, no hints of the specialized training that allowed him to move through the world like a ghost who had learned to play human. But hidden in the walls, places a child would never look, were 3 passports with different names, $40,000 in untraceable bills, and a Glock 19 with the serial number filed off. Insurance policies against the day his past finally caught up with his present. Matilda understood that her father was different from other parents. While other children's fathers talked loudly at school events and gathered in clusters to discuss sports, Arthur stood alone, always positioned where he could see every entrance and exit. She had learned not to ask about her mother or why they never visited grandparents like her classmates did. At 6 years old, she possessed an old soul's understanding that some questions were better left unasked, some stones better left unturned. Their life together existed in a carefully maintained bubble of routine and quiet affection. Arthur braided her hair each morning with fingers that could have been instruments of destruction, but instead created perfect French braids that never came loose during recess. He read to her every night, his voice soft and steady, stories about brave princesses and kind dragons, never about soldiers or shadows or the price of keeping secrets. Evelyn Mitchell commanded boardrooms with the same intensity she brought to everything in her life, a force of nature dressed in Armani and armed with algorithms. At 34, she had built Rising Edge from a startup in her garage to a technology empire worth $2 billion, driven by the memory of her younger sister Sarah, who had been killed by a stalker who had tracked her through social media vulnerabilities 10 years ago. That tragedy had transformed Evelyn from a brilliant but directionless MIT graduate into a woman with a mission: to create technology that protected rather than exposed, that shielded the vulnerable rather than empowering predators. The company's latest project, an artificial intelligence system designed to revolutionize cybersecurity, had attracted attention from corporations, governments, and less savory entities whose interests lay in the shadows between legal and illegal. The AI, which she had privately named Sarah, could predict and prevent digital intrusions before they occurred, learning and adapting faster than any human hacker could react. 2 years ago, a sophisticated hack had penetrated her personal devices, exposing private conversations and nearly destroying a crucial merger. The violation had felt personal, intimate, like someone had reached through her screen and touched her soul. Since then, she had lived behind walls of security protocols and professional paranoia, trusting only Marcus Webb, her security chief who had been with her since the garage days, a former Navy intelligence officer who understood that the most dangerous threats were the ones you never saw coming. Her recent breakup with Clinton Vaughn, a venture capitalist whose initial charm had given way to controlling behavior and veiled threats, had only intensified her sense of vulnerability. Clinton owned 40% of several defense contractors and had made it clear that her refusal to sell him the AI technology was a decision she would regret. His exact words, delivered over a $2,000 dinner at L'Espalier, still echoed in her mind. Evelyn, darling, in this world there are only two types of people. Those who sell willingly and those who sell after learning the cost of refusal. The morning after the parking garage incident, Evelyn sat in her corner office watching security footage for the 100th time. Her security chief, Marcus, stood beside her, equally transfixed by what they were seeing. The man's movements defied casual explanation. This was not some martial arts enthusiast or weekend self-defense instructor. Every motion displayed an economy of violence that spoke of years of training, the kind of training that governments provided to very specific types of individuals. The little girl's presence made the scene even more surreal. She had stood there holding a stuffed rabbit, watching her father dismantle three armed men as if he were folding laundry. Evelyn paused the video at the moment the man looked directly at the camera, his face partially obscured by shadow but his eyes visible, cold and assessing, making a calculation about whether the witness behind the lens posed a threat to his daughter. The video leaked within 48 hours. Though leaked was perhaps too innocent a word for what was clearly an orchestrated release. Someone inside Rising Edge had fed the footage to carefully selected outlets, ensuring maximum viral spread while maintaining enough ambiguity to fuel speculation. The angle, the quality, the editing, everything suggested professional handling. Internet detectives began their work immediately, freeze-framing every moment, analyzing the man's technique, speculating about his background. Former military personnel weighed in, noting details that civilian eyes would miss. The way he controlled distance, the targeting of specific pressure points, the textbook-perfect takedowns that suggested muscle memory drilled through thousands of repetitions. But despite the collective efforts of millions of amateur investigators, the man's identity remained a mystery. The few clear frames of his face yielded nothing in facial recognition databases, an impossibility in the modern age unless someone had worked very hard to erase their digital footprint. Arthur discovered the video's existence when parents at Matilda's school began staring, their conversations dying mid-sentence like birds sensing a predator. Conversations stopped when he appeared at pickup time, replaced by the heavy silence of people who thought they were in the presence of something dangerous. Teachers who had barely acknowledged his existence suddenly wanted to chat about self-defense classes for the school, their nervous laughter too high, their eyes never quite meeting his. He maintained his routine, neither confirming nor denying the whispers that followed him through the hallways like smoke from a fire that had not yet begun to burn. But when he noticed the black sedan that appeared outside Matilda's school 3 days in a row, when he recognized the pattern of surveillance that meant someone had connected the dots between the video and their quiet life in Jamaica Plain, he knew their 7 years of invisibility had ended. The sedan's engine had a specific sound, a modified exhaust that suggested government contracts and unlimited budgets. The driver never looked directly at the school, but his mirrors were angled wrong for normal driving, perfect for observation. On the 4th day, there were 2 sedans, and Arthur recognized the formation, a standard 2-car surveillance package with rotating positions and overlapping coverage. That evening, while Matilda colored at the kitchen table, humming a song about butterflies that she had learned in music class, he made preparations he had hoped never to make again. The go bag came out of its hiding place behind the water heater, its contents checked and refreshed. New batteries in the flashlights, fresh ammunition, updated maps of bus routes and train schedules. The encrypted phone he had kept charged but unused for 7 years powered on for the first time, its startup screen a ghost from a life he had tried to bury. Old reflexes returned like muscle memory, the hypervigilance that had once kept him alive in places where death came disguised as friendship. He found himself counting exits again, measuring distances in steps and seconds, calculating angles of fire from windows across the street. That night, he sat in Matilda's doorway watching her sleep, her rabbit clutched to her chest, and made a promise to her unconscious form that whatever came next, she would not pay for his sins. Evelyn's investigators worked backward through property records, employment files, and school enrollments until they found him. Arthur Graves existed on paper for exactly 7 years, his history beginning with a birth certificate for Matilda and an apartment lease in Jamaica Plain. Before that, nothing. The void where his past should have been was too perfect, too complete to be anything but deliberately crafted. When Evelyn appeared at Murphy's kitchen during the lunch rush, she found Arthur working the grill, moving between orders with the same fluid efficiency he had displayed in the parking garage. He saw her enter, their eyes met across the crowded restaurant, and she watched his shoulders tense imperceptibly before he returned his attention to the hamburger he was flipping. She waited until his shift ended, following him to the alley behind the restaurant where he stood lighting a cigarette he would not smoke, a prop to explain why he was standing in an alley with a woman in a $3,000 suit. Their conversation lasted 12 minutes. Evelyn offered him a job as her personal security consultant, a transparent excuse that fooled neither of them. Arthur declined, politely but firmly, his voice carrying the kind of finality that ended discussions. But when Evelyn mentioned, almost casually, that she was not the only one who had identified him from the video, when she described the black sedan and the men who had been asking questions at Matilda's school, his demeanor shifted. The cigarette crumbled in his fist. She watched him process the implications, saw the moment he realized that their anonymity was permanently broken. The offer changed from employment to mutual protection. She needed someone who could handle threats that conventional security could not anticipate. He needed resources and legal protection that his carefully crafted false identity could not provide. Neither trusted the other, but trust was a luxury neither could afford. The first week of their arrangement proved that Arthur and Evelyn existed in fundamentally incompatible worlds. She operated on schedules planned months in advance, every minute accounted for, every interaction scripted. He moved through life like water, adapting to whatever shape the moment required. Their first security briefing devolved into an argument when Arthur refused to follow what he called her suicide schedule, pointing out 17 vulnerabilities in her daily routine that any competent operative could exploit. She accused him of paranoia. He countered that paranoia was just pattern recognition combined with experience, and his experience suggested someone was definitely planning to kill her. The argument ended when he pulled out a tablet showing photographs taken over the past 3 days, the same faces appearing at different locations, the same vehicles following predictable patterns, the electronic signatures of surveillance equipment that someone had not bothered to properly shield. Their working relationship found its rhythm in unexpected moments. Matilda's appearance at the office one afternoon when school closed early for a water main break revealed a different side of both adults. Evelyn watched Arthur transform from hypervigilant guardian to gentle father, his voice softening as he helped his daughter with homework, at a conference table that usually hosted million-dollar negotiations. When Matilda mentioned she was hungry, Arthur disappeared into the executive kitchen and returned 20 minutes later with a meal that looked like it belonged in a 5-star restaurant. Evelyn ate her portion while reviewing contracts, but found herself stealing glances at the father and daughter, at the easy affection between them that stood in sharp contrast to the sterile perfection of her corporate world. Later, after Matilda had fallen asleep on the conference room couch, Arthur covered her with his jacket and stood guard while Evelyn worked. And for the first time in 2 years, she felt genuinely safe. The technology summit at the Boston Convention Center should have been Evelyn's triumph, the crown jewel in a career already studded with impossible achievements. Rising Edge's new AI system would be unveiled to potential clients from 43 countries, the culmination of 5 years of development and billions of dollars in investment that had consumed entire teams of the brightest minds in technology. The convention center itself had been transformed into a temple to innovation, with holographic displays and interactive demonstrations that made the future feel tangible and immediate. Arthur walked the venue the night before, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls, noting sightlines with the practiced eye of someone who had once planned operations in hostile territory, identifying choke points where a single person could control the flow of hundreds, memorizing the faces of every member of the contracted security team from photographs he had obtained through channels that no longer officially existed. He found their deployment pattern predictable, following textbook formations that any first-year operative could exploit, their equipment standard issue that would fail against anyone with genuine training, their readiness questionable based on the casual way they held their weapons and the blind spots they left unguarded. When he brought his 17 pages of documented concerns to Corbin Hayes, the head of convention security, he was dismissed as an amateur, a glorified bodyguard trying to justify his inflated paycheck with paranoid fantasies. Corbin, former Boston PD with 30 years of experience that had taught him everything except humility, resented the implication that his team was anything less than perfect, that some nobody with no official credentials could see flaws in his meticulously planned security arrangement. The conversation ended with Corbin suggesting that Arthur focus on standing still and looking intimidating while the real professionals handled the actual work of keeping people safe. The explosion occurred at 9:17 in the morning, 30 minutes before Evelyn's keynote presentation. A maintenance panel in the basement level detonated with enough force to shake the entire building, but not enough to cause structural damage. A precision that suggested intention rather than accident. Arthur moved before the echo faded, pulling Evelyn to the ground as ceiling tiles and glass from blown-out windows rained down around them. While Corbin's team ran toward the explosion, Arthur recognized the diversion for what it was and kept Evelyn pinned beneath him, counting seconds, waiting for the follow-up that never came. This had been a message, not an assassination attempt. When reporters descended like vultures, demanding to know if this was connected to the parking garage incident, Evelyn stood at the podium with glass still glittering in her hair and delivered the most important words of her career. She looked directly into the cameras and stated that Arthur Graves had her complete trust, that his quick thinking had saved lives, and that Rising Edge would not be intimidated by anonymous threats. The investigation into the explosion led Arthur down familiar paths, digital breadcrumbs that formed a pattern he recognized from another life. Blackhall Industries emerged from the shadows of shell companies and offshore accounts, a private military contractor that specialized in corporate espionage and strategic intimidation. Their client list read like a who's who of defense contractors and weapons manufacturers, companies that would profit immensely from acquiring Rising Edge's AI technology. The connection to Clinton Vaughn was not even carefully hidden, as if they wanted Evelyn to know who was behind the escalating threats. Arthur spent 3 nights piecing together the network, using skills he had promised himself he would never employ again, breaking into systems that were supposed to be impenetrable, following money trails that led to conclusions that made his blood run cold. When Evelyn confronted Clinton at his private club, the Beacon Hill Society, where membership cost more than most people's annual salary, she found him playing chess against himself, an affectation he had adopted to seem intellectual. The room smelled of old leather and older money, portraits of dead industrialists watching from the walls like judges at a trial that had been decided before it began. He did not deny the allegations, did not even pretend surprise at her appearance. Instead, he poured himself a 50-year-old scotch from a crystal decanter, the amber liquid catching the light like liquid gold, and explained with the patient tone of someone addressing a child that the world was changing, that artificial intelligence would determine the next century's balance of power, and that her stubborn refusal to see the bigger picture was forcing him to take regrettable actions. His fingers moved across the chessboard with practiced elegance, sacrificing a knight to gain position, a metaphor that was not lost on either of them. The AI she had developed could revolutionize warfare, turning conventional military forces into coordinated swarms of perfectly synchronized units, each soldier becoming a node in a network of lethal precision. Did she really think she could keep such technology locked away in corporate applications when national security was at stake? He spoke of manifest destiny and American dominance, of the Chinese threat and the Russian aggression, his words wrapped in patriotism but stinking of profit. Behind him, through windows that overlooked the common, normal people walked their dogs and pushed strollers, oblivious to the conversation that might determine whether their children grew up in a world of perpetual warfare or tentative peace. He moved a chess piece, a queen sliding across the board to threaten multiple pieces simultaneously, smiled at some private joke that made Evelyn's skin crawl, and suggested she reconsider her position before something truly unfortunate happened. Your sister Sarah, he said, letting the name hang in the air like a blade, she believed in changing the world too. Look how that ended. The crystal tumbler in Evelyn's hand cracked, scotch running through her fingers like blood, but her voice remained steady as she told him that if anything happened to anyone she cared about, she would destroy him so thoroughly that historians would struggle to prove he had ever existed. That night, Arthur told Evelyn about Shadow Unit. The words came slowly, each sentence seeming to cost him something vital. Shadow Unit had been conceived as the ultimate humanitarian force, soldiers trained not just to kill, but to protect, to extract, to prevent atrocities before they occurred. For 5 years, he had been one of 12 operatives who officially did not exist, moving through conflict zones like ghosts, saving lives that would never know they had been saved. But the program had been corrupted from within, their missions gradually shifting from protection to elimination, their targets changing from warlords and terrorists to journalists and aid workers who had seen too much. When members of the unit began questioning orders, they started dying in accidents that were anything but accidental. Arthur had seen the pattern, grabbed his infant daughter from her mother's dying arms, and disappeared into a crowd in Prague, shedding his identity like a snake sheds skin. The destruction of Shadow Unit had been systematic and complete. 11 operatives dead within 6 months, their families erased as collateral damage, their existence scrubbed from all records. Arthur survived because he had learned from the best how to become nobody, how to build an identity from scratch, how to hide in plain sight in a city where no one looked too closely at a single father trying to make ends meet. But survival came at a cost measured in constant vigilance, in weapons hidden throughout his apartment, in escape routes planned from every location, in the knowledge that one day They would find him, and Matilda would pay the price for his desertion. Evelyn listened to the story, watching his hands tremble for the first time since she had met him, understanding finally why he moved through the world like someone expecting bullets to come from any direction. The call came at 3 in the morning, Matilda's voice small and frightened on the other end of the line. Arthur listened to his daughter recite the words someone had taught her. Her favorite stuffed rabbit was lonely and wanted him to come get them both from the old place where boats used to sleep. The line went dead before he could respond. Evelyn found him standing in his apartment, every weapon he owned laid out on the kitchen table. His face a mask of controlled fury that barely contained something primal and terrible. When the second call came with demands, the trade offer of Matilda for the AI prototype, Evelyn immediately agreed to comply. Arthur said nothing, but the sound of him loading ammunition into magazine after magazine filled the silence with metallic finality. The old shipyard in East Boston had been abandoned for 20 years. Its rotting piers and rusted warehouses, a monument to industrial decay and broken promises of urban renewal. Nature had begun reclaiming the space, with vines creeping through broken windows and seabirds nesting in the rafters of buildings that had once housed the dreams of immigrant workers. The salt air had eaten through metal supports, leaving skeletal structures that groaned with every gust of wind off the harbor. Clinton had chosen the location well, demonstrating the tactical awareness that made him dangerous, despite his soft appearance and manicured hands. Multiple escape routes by land and sea created a chessboard of possibilities. Sight lines that prevented surprise approaches while offering numerous positions for his men to establish overlapping fields of fire. Enough ambient noise from the harbor to mask gunfire that would never be reported in this forgotten corner of the city. Evelyn arrived in an armored SUV that looked out of place among the decay, its black polish reflecting the sodium lights that still functioned sporadically along the abandoned streets. The prototype AI system rested in a briefcase that required her biometric signature to open, its contents worth more than the entire decaying neighborhood around them. Clinton waited on the pier with 10 men, professionals who moved with the same lethal grace Arthur displayed, fellow graduates of the shadow world, where violence was currency and death was a negotiable transaction that could be bought, sold, or traded like any other commodity. They wore no uniforms, carried no identification, existed in the space between legal and illegal, where governments conducted business they could never acknowledge. Matilda stood between two of them, still clutching her rabbit with the fierce determination of a child who understood that some things must be held on to no matter what the adult world demanded, her eyes scanning the darkness for her father with absolute faith that he would come for her. Arthur entered the shipyard from beneath, through maintenance tunnels that had flooded decades ago and now required diving equipment to navigate. The water was black as oil, thick with decades of industrial runoff, tasting of rust and decay, even through the respirator. He had entered the harbor a half-mile away, swimming against the current with the steady stroke of someone who had done this in rivers where crocodiles were the least dangerous predators. He surfaced inside a drainage pipe 50 yards from the exchange point, his approach masked by the sound of waves against rotting wood and the cry of seagulls fighting over scraps. Through his scope, a loopholed Mark IV that had been with him through 3 continents and countless operations, he counted positions, calculated angles, identified the primary threats. The man holding Matilda's hand was left-handed, would draw across his body, a half-second delay that would be his death. The sniper on the warehouse roof was using outdated night vision, first-generation equipment that would flare and die when exposed to concentrated infrared, vulnerable to the laser pointer Arthur had modified for exactly this purpose. 2 more shooters flanked the approach routes, their positions logical but predictable, chosen by someone who had learned tactics from manuals rather than massacre. Clinton stood exposed, arrogant in his assumption that money could buy victory against someone who had been trained to topple governments with nothing but determination and tactical brilliance. Arthur could hear Matilda's voice carrying across the water, singing the butterfly song to her rabbit, and the sound nearly broke his concentration. His daughter was teaching her captors about butterfly migration patterns, her voice steady and clear, showing more courage than grown men he had seen in combat. Through the scope, he saw one of the mercenaries actually listening to her, his head tilted slightly, and Arthur marked him as the first to die. Anyone who could be distracted by a child's story was too dangerous to leave operational. The exchange began according to script. Evelyn walked forward with the briefcase, her hands visible, her movements carefully telegraphed to avoid triggering nervous fingers on triggers. Clinton made a speech about progress and necessary sacrifices, about the greater good that justified individual tragedies. He had practiced the words, Arthur could tell, refined them until they sounded almost reasonable, the philosophy of someone who had never personally paid the price for the violence they ordered. When Evelyn reached the midpoint, when the briefcase required her thumbprint to continue, everything happened at once. The sniper's night vision flared and died, the laser having overloaded its circuits. Arthur's first shot took the left-handed man's weapon hand before he could clear leather. The second and third shots dropped the men flanking Clinton before they processed that they were under attack. Evelyn grabbed Matilda, pulling the child behind a concrete barrier, as Arthur emerged from shadow, no longer hiding, moving through the firefight like death itself had taken physical form. The remaining mercenaries tried to respond, but they were fighting someone who had spent years training for exactly this scenario, who knew their tactics because he had helped develop them, who moved through their formation like he was conducting a symphony of violence. Clinton tried to run, but found Evelyn blocking his path, the briefcase opened to reveal not the AI prototype but a device that transmitted a carefully crafted virus into Black Hall's servers through Clinton's own phone, which was helpfully connected to their network to coordinate the operation. Years of illegal operations, financial crimes, and assassination lists flooded into FBI and Interpol databases simultaneously. Clinton pulled a gun, his hands shaking with rage and fear. But Arthur's knife found his wrist before he could aim. And suddenly, the architect of so much misery was on his knees, crying about lawyers and connections that no longer mattered. The gunshot that caught Arthur came from an unexpected angle, a hidden shooter Evelyn had not accounted for in their planning. The bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him around, his blood painting abstract patterns on the concrete. But he kept moving, kept fighting, because Matilda was watching and he had promised her mother in those final moments in Prague that their daughter would never see him stop fighting for her. The last mercenary fell as sirens filled the air. The FBI response time remarkably quick, thanks to an anonymous tip that had included GPS coordinates and a complete roster of wanted fugitives who would be at the location. Evelyn held Arthur as the medics worked, her designer suit ruined by his blood, her composed executive facade shattered by tears she had not shed since her father's funeral 10 years ago. Matilda stood beside them, holding her rabbit in one hand and her father's finger in the other, whispering that he was not allowed to leave because they had not finished reading about the brave princess who saved the kingdom. Arthur managed to smile, to tell his daughter that this story would have a happy ending, that sometimes the princess saved everyone, even the broken knight who had forgotten he deserved saving. Recovery took 3 months that felt like 3 years and 3 seconds simultaneously. The bullet had done significant damage, tearing through muscle and tendon, chipping bone, leaving behind metal fragments that would set off airport scanners for the rest of his life. The surgeons at Massachusetts General had worked for 9 hours to repair what they called extensive traumatic damage, but what Arthur thought of as the price of admission back to the living. Physical therapy became his new battlefield. Each session, a war against his own body's desire to surrender. The therapist, a former Army medic named Janet who had seen her share of broken soldiers, pushed him past pain into agony and then through to the other side where progress lived. Matilda became a fixture at the hospital, doing homework in the waiting room, charming nurses with her serious demeanor and unexpected observations about the world. She had drawn pictures of the entire medical staff, each portrait accompanied by notes about their kindness. Nurse Patricia brings extra juice boxes, and Dr. Kim has sad eyes, but a real smile. The walls of Arthur's room became a gallery of her art, butterflies gradually giving way to pictures of 3 people holding hands. Evelyn visited daily, initially maintaining professional distance, checking on her security consultant's progress with the same efficiency she brought to quarterly reports. She would arrive at exactly 4:30, stay for precisely 1 hour, her presence as regulated as everything else in her life. But gradually, inexorably, the visits became less formal. She started bringing coffee from the shop Arthur liked, dark roast with a hint of cinnamon that reminded him of better mornings. She brought Matilda books, helped with multiplication tables, and discovered that the 6-year-old had inherited her father's ability to see through pretense to the truth beneath. One evening, she found herself still there at midnight, having spent 6 hours teaching Matilda to code on her laptop, watching the child's face light up as she made a digital butterfly fly across the screen. Arthur had pretended to sleep but watched them through barely open eyes, these 2 pieces of his heart learning to recognize each other. Marcus Webb visited twice a week, bringing intelligence updates disguised as get-well cards and surveillance reports hidden in flowers. He and Arthur had developed a grudging respect, 2 professionals recognizing competence in each other. Marcus had been the one to coordinate with the FBI, ensuring that the arrests at the shipyard led to convictions rather than legal technicalities. He had also quietly arranged for Matilda to have therapy with someone who specialized in trauma, though the therapist reported that the child seemed remarkably resilient, more concerned about her father's recovery than her own experience. "She's got your steel," Marcus told Arthur one afternoon, and it was the highest compliment either man could imagine. The first time Evelyn cooked for them, the smoke alarm went off twice, and the pasta somehow managed to be both overcooked and crunchy. Arthur watched from the couch, still moving carefully, as she cursed at his stove and threatened to have her assistant order replacement equipment. Matilda solemnly informed her that the stove worked fine, but you had to talk nicely to it, a piece of wisdom that made Arthur laugh for the first time since the shooting. They ate the questionable meal together, Matilda chattering about school, Evelyn and Arthur communicating in glances and half smiles, building something fragile and precious from the wreckage of their respective isolations. Clinton Vaughn's trial became national news. The scope of Black Hall's operations shocking even cynical observers who thought they understood how the world really worked. Dozens of executives and government officials found themselves implicated in the conspiracy, their comfortable lives destroyed by evidence that painted a picture of corruption so vast it required congressional hearings to fully understand. Evelyn testified for 7 hours, her presentation methodical and devastating, each slide of her presentation another nail in the coffin of Clinton's defense. When asked by reporters how she felt about her ex-boyfriend facing life in prison, she simply stated that justice was not about feelings but about consequences, and some consequences were long overdue. Rising Edge's AI system launched to unprecedented demand, its security applications revolutionizing how companies protected their digital assets. But Evelyn insisted on ethical restrictions, refusing contracts from organizations that failed to meet humanitarian standards, a decision that cost billions but earned something more valuable than money. She became known as the CEO who could not be bought, who had faced down death threats and emerged stronger, who had chosen principle over profit and somehow still dominated the market. The technology press called her untouchable, but Arthur knew better. He saw the nightmares that sometimes woke her, the way she still checked shadows, the armor she wore disguised as designer suits. On a crisp October afternoon, Boston Common blazed with autumn colors that looked painted by an artist who favored drama over subtlety. Matilda ran ahead, chasing leaves that danced on the wind, her laughter carrying back to where Arthur and Evelyn walked side by side. Other families filled the park, normal people living normal lives, unaware that among them walked a ghost who had returned to life and a warrior who had learned that strength could take many forms. Arthur moved without his former predatory grace, the shoulder injury having left him with a slight hitch in his stride that would never fully heal. A reminder written in scar tissue of the price of redemption. Evelyn watched Matilda play, seeing in the child's joy something she had lost in boardrooms and spreadsheets, a simplicity that cut through complexity like Alexander's sword through the Gordian knot. She had spent so many years building walls, each betrayal adding another layer of protection, until she had become unreachable even to herself. But this strange, violent, gentle man and his extraordinary daughter had found a way past every defense, not by force but by simply existing in her presence, with their complicated love and uncompromising loyalty. When she had asked Arthur why he trusted her with their safety, he had replied that trust was not given but built, one small moment at a time, and they had been building something together since that night in the parking garage. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Evelyn asked the question that had haunted her since the shipyard. If he had never met her, would his life have remained peaceful? Would Matilda have grown up without seeing her father covered in blood? Would their carefully constructed anonymity have held for another 7 years or forever? Arthur stopped walking, turned to face her fully, his eyes holding that same intensity she had first seen in the security footage but tempered now with something softer. Perhaps he would have remained hidden, he admitted. Perhaps they could have continued their quiet existence in Jamaica Plain until Matilda graduated and went to college and started a life unburdened by his past. But peace without purpose was just another form of death, he continued, and watching Evelyn fight for something greater than profit, seeing her refuse to compromise even when it would have been safer to surrender, had reminded him that some battles were worth emerging from shadow to fight. Matilda needed to see that courage was not the absence of fear, but action despite terror, that standing up to evil was not optional but essential, that love was not just protection but partnership. She had saved him as much as he had saved her, pulled him from a different kind of drowning, one measured in years of hiding rather than moments of violence. Together, they had created something neither could have built alone. A future where Matilda could grow up seeing that broken people could heal each other, that families could be chosen rather than just born, that love could bloom in the most unlikely soil. The child ran back to them, leaves clutched in her small fists, distributing her treasures with the seriousness of someone conducting a vital ceremony. She placed a perfect maple leaf in Evelyn's hand, declaring it matched her eyes, then gave her father an oak leaf because it was strong like him. And this one, she said, producing a golden birch leaf with the flourish of a magician, is for all of us together, because it's beautiful and whole, even though it fell from the tree. As she ran off again, chasing new adventures with the boundless energy of a child who had learned that the world could be dangerous but was not afraid, Arthur took Evelyn's hand, their fingers interlacing with the same precision he once reserved for assembling weapons. They walked together through the gathering dusk, three people who had found each other in violence but chose to build something from the ashes of their respective damages. The city moved around them, Unaware and uncaring, millions of lives intersecting and diverging in patterns too complex for any AI to fully map. Street musicians played for quarters, their melodies mixing with traffic sounds and distant sirens to create the symphony of urban existence. But in their small circle of connection, in the space between a father's protection and a woman's ambition, in a child's laughter that rang like bells through the autumn air, they had created something worth defending. Not with guns or technology or money, but with the simple, revolutionary act of choosing each other, again and again, each day, a renewal of a promise that had never been spoken, but was understood in every shared glance, every quiet moment, every step forward into an uncertain but no longer solitary future. 6 months later, when Rising Edge went public with an evaluation that made Evelyn one of the youngest billionaires in America, she stood at the podium of the New York Stock Exchange with Arthur in the crowd, no longer hiding, no longer running, just a man watching the woman he loved change the world. Matilda sat on his shoulders, wearing a dress Evelyn had helped her pick out, waving at the cameras with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved, protected, and part of something larger than herself. When reporters asked Evelyn what drove her success, she looked directly at Arthur and Matilda and said, "Family. The family you're born with, the family you choose, and the family that chooses you back." The closing bell rang, its sound echoing through the canyon of buildings. But Arthur heard only Matilda's delighted laugh, and Evelyn's whispered "thank you" carried on the wind. They had all saved each other, in ways both violent and tender, and in that salvation had found not just survival but a reason to survive. The ghost had become a man again, the warrior had learned to trust, and the child had gained a mother who would teach her to change the world with code instead of bullets.